Wizard101 is one of the most beloved MMOs out there. Even 16 years after its 2008 launch, its servers are still running stronger than ever, surviving long past its competitors. Seriously, remember Pirates of the Caribbean Online? Me neither. Most people remember Wizard101 for its abundance of unique and charming spells. I mean, what would a wizard-themed game be without being able to summon powerful angels, beasts, and monsters? But it's no surprise that with hundreds of good spells introduced over the years, we've also gotten our fair share of bad spells. Whether they're too situational or just poorly designed, today we'll be diving into Wizard101's worst, most forgettable spells and seeing how we can make them better. Everyone knows Precision. It's a 0 pip 25 accuracy buff that balance wizards get as early as level 7. But nobody uses Precision. It usually just sits around collecting dust in your spellbook, and for good reason. Because wasting a whole turn just to add 25 extra accuracy to your next spell is hardly ever a good idea. Sure, there's a few spells out there with unusually low accuracy that could maybe benefit from this, like Supernova, Berserk Kraken, or the original Wild Bolt from way back in 2010, but that's just 3 spells out of literal thousands, and one of them doesn't even exist anymore. Also, by the time you enter mid-game, you should have over max accuracy from gear anyway, so you'll never fizzle anything, making Precision completely useless. You may be wondering, well, what about all the times you get mantled? Won't Precision come in handy then? And the answer is no, not really. Because by the time you are mantled, unless you somehow predicted it by casting Precision the previous round, which is nearly impossible, it's too late. And even then, Precision's value is just too low to effectively counter a mantle. If I'm wasting a turn to predict countering a mantle which may or may not even happen, then I at least deserve to pull my hit off the next round, which is why I think an appropriate buff to Precision would be doubling its value from 25 to 50. This would allow it to completely counter the effects of any mantle, with some extra accuracy left over. Mantles are a huge problem late game with boss fights like Malus, Mithraea Rematch, and Medulla Challenge Mode that spam your whole team with them over and over. So having an extra 50% accuracy buff could definitely come in clutch. I mean, of all the forgotten spells out there, KI clearly wants players to use this one because they won't stop giving it attention. Like in April 2017, it was added to the list of trainable balance spells of the Arcanum, meaning now any player could obtain it. I still can't believe Precision was chosen instead of Balance Blade or Blade Storm. Why, KI? And in spring 2021, KI actually did buff its value from 10% to 25%. Yep, it was even worse at one point. As a bonus, I'd buff both Lightning Strike and Guidance as well. Lightning Strike deserves an even higher 60% accuracy, since it's more situational given it only applies to your next Storm spell, the same reason KI gave Stormblade a higher value than Balance Blade. And Guidance's value should be doubled from an AoE 20% to an AoE 40%, if we're following the same ×2 formula that we did for Precision. Lastly, one more idea that is worth mentioning but probably too hard for KI to implement would be making it so accuracy buffs only apply to hits, because right now, Precision's biggest flaw is that players accidentally waste it on a utility spell with already perfect accuracy the following round. So if KI was able to bypass utility spells and just apply Precision to hits, players would feel more inclined to use it. Let me ask you a question. What unique trait about Ice Armor sets it apart from every other spell in the entire game? The answer is that Ice Armor's the only non-astral spell that's completely replaceable. And by that, I mean it's the only spell in existence that's an objectively worse version of another spell, Frozen Armor. Seriously, there's no other pair of spells like this. By the way, I'm not counting astral spells because they were intentionally designed to be replaceable. But yeah, even spells that seem like worse versions of others, like Plague versus Virulent Plague, are different enough such that Plague is still a better option in some situations, like if you only have 1 pip. But that's the thing. In no situation ever would ice armor be more useful than frozen armor. Ice armor's strictly worse, because frozen armor does the exact same thing for the same amount of pips, except with more value. And you could use it on anyone, not just yourself. Sure, you have to wait until level 55 to get frozen armor versus 18 for ice armor, but a difference in level requirement doesn't justify one spell having an advantage over another. I think the best way to fix ice armor is to completely differentiate it from frozen armor, and by that I mean making it an AoE absorb instead of a single absorb. But how much value per pip should it have? Well, to determine its new value, I could consult one of the many charts KI's provided us with during past spell audits, but an easier way is just to compare ice armor and frozen armor to Tempest and Judgment, their respective X-pip counterparts. Frozen armor's value is currently 1.75 times the amount of Judgment. So, if we follow the same formula and apply a 1.75 times multiplier on Tempest's 80 AoE damage per pip, we'd get 140 AoE shield per pip as a result. I really like having each armor spell serve a different purpose. Need to play it safe by covering everyone on your team for a little less value? Cast ice armor. Want to gamble and choose only one person to cover, but with a crazy high amount of value? Cast frozen armor. And as a bonus, I think players should be allowed to critical off their absorbs. Think about it. If my opponent's casting a critical hit on me, it's only fair that I can counter with a critical absorb. Plus, crit heals are a thing, so come on KI, what are you waiting for? Technically this wouldn't just buff ice armor, but every other absorb as well. I'm sure if I took a poll to see how many of you ever cast Dimension Shift in your life, over 99% of you would say no. In fact, I'd bet most of you never even heard of this spell. And that's not your fault. Dimension Shift truly is one of the worst spells in the game, due to how incredibly difficult it is to set up and how situational it is. It's a myth utility spell you get at level 75 that trades all hanging effects with your minion, meaning it takes all the charms, wards, and overtimes from you, the charms, wards, and overtimes from your minion, and then swaps them for 6 pips. Meaning in order for this spell to actually be useful, you need to hit all the following criteria. 1, you need to have a minion up. Let me remind you that minions do not level scale, meaning most minions are completely useless past Arc 1, so yeah, it's pretty unlikely you'll ever have one up, unless you accidentally spawned one from this. 2, your minion has to have a bunch of hanging effects that you'd want to steal, like blades and shields, which probably won't ever happen because minions frequently hit and get hit, which uses up both of them. And 3, you need to actually pull Dimension Shift at the right time and be able to part with 6 whole pips to cast it. Yeah, that's not worth it. Believe it or not, Dimension Shift actually did play a niche role in competitive PvP for a brief period of time back in 2017 when Jade stalling was at its worst. During this time, toxic death wizards would spam bad juju almost every single round, absolutely smothering you in weaknesses. So a hard counter to this was simply dimension shifting them all off to your minion. But not too long after this approach was discovered, in summer 2018, KI nerfed bad juju for PvP, leaving Dimension Shift with no purpose once again. I actually have 3 different ideas on how to fix this spell. One fix would be chopping its pip cost in half from 6 down to 3. In fact, this is actually how the spell was during Test Realm in April 2012. But KI raised its pip cost to 6 before hitting Live Realm in fear of players easily setting up and stealing 40% balance blades and 70% tower shields. What a terrible reason to nerf it. Again, minions hit and get hit, so they'll hardly ever keep their buffs on for you to steal. And even if you miraculously were able to stack buff minions and shield minions, you're still going through all that trouble turn after turn, and then taking another turn to cast Dimension Shift, when you could just be, I don't know, hitting? So yeah, 3 pips is more than okay for that. But here's a more fun idea. Keep the spell at 6 pips, but instead of trading effects with your minion, trade effects with your opponent instead. Does your opponent have a couple blades you want to steal? Do you have a couple traps you want to push? Just cast it on them. Believe it or not, this version of Dimension Shift actually already exists in the game, but as an extremely rare 8-pip item card known as Disjunction that's only available from a Crowns Pack hat or a $10 pet jewel. So yeah, just scrap the current concept of Dimension Shift and make it do a 6-pip version of what Disjunction already does, because that's a much more effective utility that has no reason being locked behind a paywall. My final idea for fixing Dimension Shift that's completely different from the others and would only work in PvE, which is fine because the devs already banned it from PvP, is to make it a really weak 6-pip 200 damage hit, but if you get the kill shot with it, the enemy you killed swaps sides to become your minion. With monstrology existing in the game, KingsIsle already has a friendly minion version of almost every single enemy in the game's code, so this really shouldn't be too hard for them to implement. Also, to prevent this spell from becoming too overpowered, I'd make this enemy stealing effect only apply to mobs and not bosses. But yeah, this idea would incorporate 2 new mechanics we've never seen before, a kill shot mechanic and an enemy stealing mechanic, both of which would be very cool additions to the game. And I feel like this idea best fits the spell's name, Dimension Shift, since you're literally shifting the enemy's dimension from their side onto yours. Anyway, let me know in the comments which of these 3 Dimension Shift changes is your favorite. I'm curious what you all think. By show of hands, who here uses Mutate Spells? That's what I thought, none of you. And I can't blame you because they're completely unnecessary and way too situational in combat. Combine that with their only trainer literally being hidden behind a wall in the most obscure zone ever, so you'd never actually encounter him to learn these spells without using a wiki, and yeah, what a disaster. If it wasn't for the hordes of Mutate TC in the bazaar, you probably wouldn't even know these spells existed. So what do? Well, Sun School mutation spells work similarly to the Sun School enchantment spells you're familiar with. But instead of adding damage or accuracy to a spell, they straight up changed the spell into an entirely different one. And unlike enchants, which can modify any spell, mutate spells only work on a single specific one. For example, assume you're a myth wizard who decided to learn Mutate Minotaur. Casting it converts a regular Minotaur into a deadly Minotaur. Sure, this adds 170 damage to its base value, which sounds good in theory, but it completely changes the spell's school to death, meaning you can no longer use your power pips on it, rendering it completely useless. Meaning the only players who can use Mutate Minotaur effectively are Death Wizards, since only their power pips could be used on the resulting spell. So as a Death Wizard, you need to waste additional training points training every myth spell up to Minotaur. So yeah, this spell's already extremely costly and situational. And on top of that, you can't enchant mutated hits, meaning after you mutate a Minotaur into Deadly Minotaur, you can't further buff its base damage with another Sun spell. So this spell isn't even worth it for Death Wizards. If you need a 5-pip death hit, just cast an enchanted Skeletal Pirate. It does even more damage without wasting several training points and clogging your deck with myth spells. I mean, this whole mutate mechanic just doesn't make sense to me. Why should only one school benefit from each mutate spell? And if there's 7 schools and 7 mutate spells, shouldn't each school get 1 mutate spell? Why do Death and Fire get 2? Myth and Balance get nothing. And KI clearly knows how useless mutate spells are because they completely gave up on this entire mechanic. They haven't added a single new one since their original batch during Celestia's release in 2010. It's been 14 years. It's time for a change. I think the best fix for mutate spells is instead of just having one output, make it so each mutate spell has 6 possible outputs, one for every other school. And then make it so each mutate spell converts into your own school. This would drastically increase usability, because now every player could cast every mutate spell with the ability to use their own power pips on the resulting card. So, back to the Mutate Minotaur example, Instead of it converting Minotaur into just Deadly Minotaur, have it convert into one of 6 options, whichever one is your school. You might be thinking, wouldn't it be too much work for KI to add and animate 5 more variants to every mutatable spell? Well, not really, considering KI constantly releases tons of new spell variants in the form of spellement upgrades. Plus, most of the animations already exist for alternate school variants of mutated spells. And we've already seen instances of the spell mechanic where something different occurs based on the school of you or your opponent, like in the beastmoon spell Call Witness, which summons a minion of the opponent's school. So yeah, KI is more than capable of adding all the remaining school variants for each mutated spell. I mean, there's only 7 mutate spells anyway, and since one variant already exists, and we wouldn't need a variant for the base school, that's what, just 35 new variants? Overall, I just think this change is a super fun and creative way to bring these long-forgotten mutate spells out of obscurity. By the way, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It helps out the channel and lets me know you want to see more of these types of videos. With that said, let's look at the next underwhelming Wizard101 spell. I think the greatest downfall of any spell's use rate in all of Wizard101 history belongs to the 4 stun-only spells. Both the single stuns, Stun and Freeze, as well as their AoE counterparts, Blinding Light and Choke, have pretty much become entirely abandoned by the player base. And it's a shame because at one point they were actually useful in PvP. That is until KI banned them from PvP during the Polaris Raid update in June 2024, effectively nuking them considering no one will ever use them in PvE because main game bosses are literally stun immune. So I think a good solution to make these spells viable once again would be adding a small conditional mantle on your target if they're stun immune. So yeah, it'll still stun your enemy, but if your enemy is stun immune, whether it's a PvE boss, a player with stun resist gear, or with a conviction aura up, then you throw a 25% mantle on them instead. That way, you can at least do something to a stun immune enemy. Oh, and I wouldn't count stun blocking towards this condition, because if someone actually takes a precautionary turn to cast stun block, then they shouldn't be punished for it. Plus, you'll still need some way to remove an opponent's stun block, so it would count as a stun to remove it. And just to clarify, I'd only apply this small conditional mantle to stun-only spells, meaning spells like Stormlord and Frost Giant wouldn't change. I feel like keeping the conditional mantle at 25% here seems appropriate, as it wouldn't allow these stun-only spells to outclass their regular mantle counterparts. Overall, I think this conditional mantle would let these stun-only spells once again see the light of day, without going overboard with unrealistic changes like entirely scrapping stun immunity from the game or increasing stun duration. Ever since Shadow Magic was introduced during the Chrysalis Part 1 update in November 2013, it's changed the game forever. With Shadow Pips, you can cast extremely useful shadow spells like transformations, pip donations, and of course, those shadow-enhanced hits you all know and love today. But what about that 4th type of shadow spell that gets left in the dust, completely forgotten by the player base? That's right. The 3 shadow hits you can learn from Alana Darksun and Chrysalis. Man, these spells are weird. For starters, they're just too confusing for the casual player. Immediately upon casting one, you'll see a shadow crawl up from behind you. The idea here is that the shadow has a mind of its own and will hit after 2 rounds. But before then, if you please your shadow by casting something it likes, like a blade or a trap, it'll interrupt cast a damage buff of its own. For example, watch me cast Dark Fiend. Immediately after casting it on round 1, it'll interrupt cast a 40% Shadow Blade. Then on round 2, if I make it happy by casting a blade, it'll interrupt cast a 10% Shadow Spear. And finally, on round 3, if I cast another blade, It'll interrupt cast again with a 25% AoE shadow trap before it finally hits. So, to maximize your shadow's full potential, you'll want to blade or trap every single round it's up. This overly complex process, combined with backlash, a whole other mess I won't get into, makes these 3 shadow hits just too convoluted for a casual player. And on top of that, these spells are just terrible. They're the only pure shadow hits in the entire game you have access to, aside from wand hits, meaning they're inherently weaker than your other hits since they don't use your own school's damage stat. They also can't be enchanted at all, which is just strange. But let's be real, the biggest issue with these spells is their ridiculously high pip cost of 2 whole shadow pips. Considering it could take up to 3 or 4 rounds for you to even gain just 1 shadow pip, by the time you finally get one, you're way better off casting your own school shadow enhanced hit for faster and stronger damage. I think the best way to fix these 3 underwhelming spells is simply to scale them down by cutting both their pip cost but also their damage in half. Because for 1 shadow pip, you'll have plenty more opportunities to actually cast them. And don't be put off by their reduced damage, because they'll still pack a punch from all the buffs they interrupt cast. If anything, this damage reduction incentivizes players to feed into their likes even more, since you'll really need those interrupt cast buffs to make up for the lack of base damage. So, these 3 spells would now lean further into their Shadow School identity, and isn't that what good spell design is all about? Solar Surge is a spell that so desperately needs a fix, because it's quite literally broken. Seriously, it's impossible to use this spell. Let me explain. Back when Caramel came out in November 2020, KI made some significant changes to PvP. A big concern of lead designer Rapbeard was just how broken Sun School damage enchants were in PvP, because they made low-rank spells way too overpowered. To balance this, he first banned all pre-existing damage enchants, and replaced them with one new damage enchant specifically designed for PvP, Solar Surge. Instead of applying a fixed damage buff like the others, Solar Surge applies 50 damage per pip to each spell, capping at 300 damage for spells rank 6 and up. So, for example, a 1-pip Firecat would only get plus 50 damage from this, but a 6-pip Helephant would get plus 300. This way, damage is better scaled per pip than the previous method of just bombing your opponent with a nasty plus 300 Firecat. All was good for a while, until a year and a half later during the launch of 5th Age PvP in April 2022, when suddenly KI changed their mind and straight up banned Solar Surge from PvP. Apparently, this was because of community backlash regarding it being locked behind the veteran rank. So that's right, the removal of Solar Surge from PvP meant it became the first and only spell in the entire game to be banned from both PvE and PvP, making it completely and utterly useless. Seriously, it's just disabled from all combat now. KI ended up removing it from Diego's list of trainable spells, but what's super funny is that if you happen to train it while it was available between the years 2020 and 2022, and you never bought back your training points, it'll still show up in your spellbook today. Let me know in the comments if you're one of the few remaining players out there that has it. Anyway, let's fix this spell. I think a good fix for Solar Surge would be reworking it into another PvE damage enchant, specifically one that adds 225 damage, 25 accuracy, and 10% pierce to a spell. Because right now in late game combat, the only damage enchant players use is Epic. There's zero variety anymore, and KI knows this because they literally stopped continuing their line of accuracy enchants. So, a new Jack-of-all-trades enchant with slightly less damage than Epic, but additional accuracy and pierce as a trade-off, would provide players with another useful alternative to enchant their spells. I can see this being useful against late-game bosses that spam mantles, like Malus, or instances where you need a little extra pierce to break through heavy shielders, while not sacrificing too much damage. It's worth noting I'd make this spell trainable at level 110 from the Astral Arcanum Scholar, the same level and trainer you get Epic at. And I chose these values by combining the effects of both Gargantuan and Unstoppable, the two final Celestia Sun spells you get at level 58. I feel like the combined effects of two level 58 enchants make for a balanced level 110 enchantment. Overall, this change would be the perfect way to bring this spell out of complete obscurity. I mean, as it stands, players can't even use it. Plus, design-wise, this change stays close to its original mechanic, and definitely fits the name, Solar Surge, given it encompasses all three stat buffs this Solar School is known for. The last underwhelming spell I want to fix is Cooldown, the utility spell Ice Wizards get at level 75. Just by looking at it, you could see exactly why it's so unfavorable among players. Because for 1 pip, you're just removing 1 tick from all damage over times on you and your allies. Now tell me, why on earth would you ever want to remove just 1 tick from everyone's damage over time with cooldown when mass triage exists? Because for 2 pips, you could just remove the whole thing. Sure, cooldown applies to every single dot on you and your allies, whereas mass triage only removes 1 dot from you and your allies. So, in circumstances where your team is absolutely smothered in dots, cooldown could potentially outshine mass triage. But how often do you get AoE dot spammed in PvE? The only fight I can possibly think of is the first boss fight in Darkmoor's Graveyard, where the minions spam mass frostbite. So sure, here cooldown outclasses mass triage, but besides that one singular boss fight in the entire game, you're better off casting mass triage. So how can we fix cooldown? I personally think it needs a whole new rework. Dot manipulation just isn't in Ice's repertoire to begin with. Like if you look at the Rochambeau wheel, which is what modern Wizard101 developers base school design on, it makes perfect sense why life can counter fire with dot removal. But ice? Ice shouldn't touch damage over times at all. The two things ice is designed to counter are blades and weaknesses. So after brainstorming a little, I narrowed my ideas down to a mass version of disarm, so an AoE enemy blade removal, and a mass version of cleanse charm, so an AoE ally weakness removal. Both would be very useful, but after careful consideration, I'd have to go with a mass weakness removal. I think this would greatly benefit players in PvE. I mean, players have been requesting mass cleanse charm for ages. And these days, with so many late game bosses spamming mantles and weaknesses, I think this new version of cooldown would really come in handy. Also, it stays close to its original spell design by serving as a mass utility spell. So there you go. A handful of fixes for a handful of underwhelming Wizard101 spells. Which ones did you agree with? Are there any other spells you'd fix? Let me know in the comments. And hopefully one day, KI will bring these useless spells out of obscurity, but until then, they'll remain long forgotten.